Hey, deserving listeners, it's time to continue watching the Demi Lovato documentary on YouTube. Let's watch the show. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor, and I'm going to react to it as I watch.
I actually don't think people realize how bad it actually was. I had 3 strokes. I had a heart attack. I suffered brain damage from the strokes. I can't drive anymore. And I have blind spots in my vision. So sometimes when I go to pour a glass of water, I'll totally miss the cup because I can't see it anymore.
Okay, so I didn't show all of the clips because I think a lot of it might be actually difficult to watch. And by the way, trigger warning on all my videos, let alone this one. She had the overdose and it was quite severe, and they went to somewhat graphic detail on the medical emergency that she went through. And she just talked about how during the emergency, I think she had used opiates, heroin, I'm guessing, and overdosed. The physicians had apparently stabilized her, but she had had strokes and a heart attack, and she now has brain damage. And she's talking about how she has some vision loss and she can't drive a car anymore. And I'm just going to throw this out there, and maybe she'll talk about this, but you can have more subtle damage or subtle changes to your cognitive functioning and other functions of the brain that can lead to personality changes, depression, mania, forgetfulness, compulsions. There's a lot of different effects that can happen from stroke. So maybe she'll get into that, but I hope that she's okay. I hope that she doesn't have those effects, but it can be an effect of injury to the brain that is harder. It's easy to notice, oh, I can't see in this zone of my vision anymore. It's harder to notice that your mood is different, or the way you perceive the world is different, or your motivations are different. Those are harder things to detect. Hopefully she doesn't have any effects like that.
Addiction until you just become an asshole.
It wasn't fair, actually, to everyone that was around me during that time, because when I did end up in the hospital, they were kind of thrown for a loop too of whoa, what the have you been doing? What do you mean? And that was my fault. That was me manipulating the people around me and making sure they never found out.
Yeah, that's a really common scenario. When people go down a road of chronic use, of daily use, they're often quite ashamed, or they are so desperate to stay in connection with the substances that they know if they tell people that other people are going to stand in their way, at the very least emotionally, if not practically. And so because they're so dependent on the substance for a variety of reasons that I went into in the last videos, they will dedicate a lot of their brain power and effort into hiding it. And a lot of people, very close, even partners and spouses, husbands and wives, will say, I had no idea, because the person hid it so well. There's a myth out there that if someone's really high or very intoxicated on a particular substance, then it would be very noticeable. And sometimes it is, for sure, when you're using opiates and you take too much, which usually is what people are trying to avoid. But if you use too much, you'll be very sleepy and very tired. But even then, you could claim, oh, I'm just really tired, I just need to go to bed. Or if you're on another substance and you're very drunk, obviously that's pretty easy to detect. But if you're using all the time, your tolerance is very high, and your ability to hold it together, so to speak, under influence is also pretty practiced. And they're shocked. And I think that it's important for us to know that, because when we have people in our lives who we might worry about, I think it's important not to assume that we would see their intoxication, and thus, if we don't see their intoxication, then, things must be okay. And which leads me to another topic of, well, what do we do? What do you do if you have a partner or a spouse or family member or a friend that you suspect is worried? Well, it's hard to know, because as I was talking about last time, and as they're talking, I don't know if I included it, that there's a lot of different philosophies about recovery and about addiction, but a very accurate one and a very wise one is one that is shared by Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and other fields that will be very expert along the lines of substance addiction, is that the person suffering from the addiction is powerless over their compulsion. They do not have the ability to exert their control over ending their problem. And so if the person who has the problem is powerless over the problem, then certainly their family members and friends are even more powerless, meaning that they have even less power over the problem. And it's this idea that helps us to understand, no, we can't just tell someone to stop, or and I'll get a lot of emails for the podcast. You know, someone will say, oh, my friend is suffering from this and that, and what do I do? And it's often based on this assumption that as a friend or a family member, if you do the right thing, then you'll be able to get the person to stop. And maybe a 1-2% chance that that's true, but the vast majority of the time, again, not only do you not have power, but they don't have power either. So to assume that there's some magical combination of things that you could say or interventions that you could do will help them is a notion that I think is helpful in some circumstances, but not this one. Well, what does help? Well, that's a hard question to answer, really, because if I had the answer to that question, I would be a trillionaire, because so many people suffer from this. And there's a lot of ideas out there, a lot of myths. There's a lot of absolute statements that people will say, AA, you have to go to AA, you have to go to NA. Other people say AA and NA are stupid, they don't work. And there's just a lot of people debating these kinds of things. And I've treated a lot of people with addiction, and I'm here to tell you that it's varied. It's particular to each person. The journey of recovery is always individual to the individual, and it's never clean. It's always messy. It usually has relapses. There's usually ups and downs, and it often lasts a lifetime, which is a big bummer for people. We tend to think it's like, okay, if you just get sober and you get you get back onto your feet again, and okay, you do the work for 5 years, that's a long time, you should be okay. And with people like Demi Lovato, who I think suffers from a kind of compulsive problem that she will probably carry with her the rest of her life, it's a lifetime problem. And imagine having to have a robust system of sobriety in place so that you can get sober, and you have to do this every day for the rest of your life. And for a lot of people who are suffering from addiction and are in the beginning stages of recovery, this fact will actually bum them out so much that they won't even try to get sober. And that's why AA, they say one day at a time. And they call it don't future trip, because the more you future trip, the more that voice in your mind, that compulsive demon in your brain, if you will capitalize on and say, it's too much work, you're never going to get it done, you might as well just use. And that's why they say one day at a time, just one day at a time, just, one, and some even say 1 hour at a time or 1 minute at a time. Don't even worry about 24 hours, just worry about right now. What are you going to do right now? So what do you do? Well, what we need to get people into usually, and this isn't the case, some people just quit. You hear anecdotes of people just saying, I just decided one day it was over. I never went to meetings. I never talked to a therapist. I just quit and everything's been fine. That can happen. That is extremely rare. And every person going through recovery wishes that they are that person. Most people wish that they could just say that, but it's almost never the case. And in fact, that's part of that compulsive voice. Is like, you don't need help. It's too shameful. It's too much trouble. You don't need to admit you have a problem to all these people. You don't have to go through all you're different. You're better than those other people. You can manage this on your own. That's often that voice. And it's hard to know, because maybe they are one of those people. Maybe they are one of those 1 in 1,000 people that can just quit cold turkey without any help at all. But it's hard to know. And so what we are usually looking for is an intensive recovery system in the beginning, and then tapering off, and then ongoing maintenance recovery systems for the rest of their life. So what does that look like? Well, in the beginning, it is everyday work. So every day they're going to a NA meeting or an AA meeting. They are in contact with sober people. They are telling everyone around them. And this is a big problem for a lot of people that suffer from compulsions, is they're often quite ashamed of themselves. And Demi Lovato is leading the way by reducing that shame, by reducing the stigma, by talking about it. And her doing this documentary could literally be part of her recovery. I don't know. But a big part of it is surrender. And a lot of people who suffer from addictions will have this persona that they're constantly trying to put out there. And they're terribly ashamed not only of their use, but probably of a lot of other things. I've been talking about how relational traumas can lead to addiction. So anyway, a big part of the recovery in the beginning, and maybe even forever, is them just being very vocal. That's why in NA and AA meetings, part of the recovery process is this voluntary thing where the people will stand up in meetings and say, my name is Demi Lovato and I'm an addict. Part of that is just releasing that narcissism of I'm above this. You have to say, I have this problem. And that's another part of the steps, is like you have to admit you have a problem. That can be really hard too. So you have to admit you have the problem. You have to admit that you don't have power over it. You have to, meaning that you do have power over the system, but you don't have the willpower to change it. That's what that step means, is you have to admit that you don't have power, meaning that I don't have the power to just willpower my way out of this. That is not possible. It's not possible for anyone. Now, I just got done saying 1 in 1,000, I don't know the stats, but people claim anecdotally that they did have that power. But that, again, is extremely rare. And you could argue that that person didn't have a sort of classic addiction. They just were using things because they wanted to, and one day they just didn't want to. There are people like that. Demi Lovato comes across in all the different signs of someone who actually has an ongoing compulsive psychological problem. But anyway, so we need to create a system for the person. In the beginning, again, it's daily meetings or some sort of daily check-in where the individual is talking about their feelings. There's going to be wild emotions when they get sober. They're going to be up, they're going to be down. And when they're down, that's when and even when they're up or down, they're at risk of using. When they're up, they're like, I can do anything. That's okay. I just one drink. And when they're down, they're like, what's the point? I'm just going to drink. I need to cope. Or very frustrated, very angry. Why is this? Well, when the substances are vacating your brain, essentially, you are going to have a lot of symptoms. Your brain is telling you, get that substance back. It's similar to caffeine addiction. If you drink like 3 cups of coffee a day, and one day you just don't drink coffee, you'll feel something. It'll feel bad. You'll feel like you have the flu sometimes, and that's your brain saying, "Get that substance back." I mean, I'm simplifying it, but anyway. So, if the first step is often there's a lot of emotions. After a few weeks, that usually dissipates. Maybe even after a week. But then we're talking about the emotions that the substances helped us to deal with. I talked about this in a previous video, that a lot of people are using substances as a way of helping them just get through the day emotionally. And they've had their whole lives dealing with distress spikes and self-esteem problems, and then they take the substance and it just all goes away. Demi Lovato talked about how her favorite mixture was an upper and a downer. So in the beginning it was a Xanax and cocaine, and then later on it became crack cocaine and heroin. And so why did she like that? Why would she want to go up and down? Well, there's a lot of different effects that these sort of mixtures can have, but one of the things that it can do is it takes away so the downers will take away the pain, and sometimes the upper will take away the pain, but the heroin and the Xanax will often, particularly heroin, will just take away any kind of pain, physiological or psychological. It takes away the pain, and you can just kind of breathe. And then the upper gives you the energy to do things that you want to do. And so I'm just taking a guess that her emotions when she's sober are very hard for her to deal with. And so you have a lifetime of emotions, relational traumas that you've been putting off because you've been using substances to avoid it this whole time. And now that you get sober, all those emotions come crashing like a tidal wave on the shore. You have that, but you also have the tremendous amount of shame you have, because usually when you're going through recovery, you recently hit bottom a number of times and you're looking back and you're just like, what did I do? And now you have to make amends with everyone, and it's a lot. It's just a daily onslaught of self-esteem problems, and you do not have your best friend, your substance, to help you get through it. So there has to be a lot of support around the emotional ups and downs for those people. Therapy, talking about it, a venue where other people know what you're doing. Obviously, not hanging out with people that use substances, because if they have substances, it'll be a temptation. Cutting yourself off. I've been with clients, okay, right now you're going to text your dealer and you're going to tell them that you're going through recovery and to never sell to you again. Some dealers will abide by that, some won't. Many dealers will. They'll say, okay, I get it, you're going through recovery, I don't want to be a part of your problem. And so you can just text your dealer, say, don't sell to me no matter what I ask you, that kind of thing. And that can be another barrier to the temptation. You need your family around you as best you can. There needs to be no boredom is another big problem when people are going through recovery, particularly early recovery, and they get bored. That's when the compulsion starts to plague them. So there needs to be activities, often with other sober people, and isolation is not okay. And stinking thinking, they call it. You can get real angry. Anyway, I'm sort of going down a road that maybe I should stop. But the point is that there's a whole system. It's not just the person with their willpower. There's a whole system of meetings and boredom management, emotional management, trauma recovery, therapy, medical appointments, relationships, being vocal, admitting you have a problem, going through the steps. Hard work. It is hard work. No, accepting the fact that in the first year, often, your mood will be terrible. Not only because you're ashamed of what's happening, not only because you're dealing with emotions you haven't been dealing with, but also because the thing that they often leave out is that the substances were often their best friend. And that's hard for a lot of people to understand. If you've never been in that position before, you'd be like, why would heroin be your best friend? Heroin's a terrible drug. For the people that used it, it was such a wonderful thing. It was their ticket to happiness, to socializing, to feeling normal, to getting through the day. It was there for them. They develop a kind of intimate relationship with it because it's like a pet where it never says no to them. It always gives them what they want. It's like a warm blanket. So people even talk about heroin as this warm blanket. And by the way, don't ever use it. It is highly addictive. A lot of these substances are. And obviously talk with your therapist and your physician and maybe your family about these kinds of things if you ever have urges. But anyway, so without that best friend, it's a loss. You are grieving a loss of something that you really loved, or maybe it's just drugs in general. And when you give that up, it's a loss. And it might be hard for other people to understand that, but you grieve it like someone died. You're grieving, we saw clips, I didn't show them, of Demi Lovato having all this fun while she was drinking and socializing. And you can't do that anymore. Like Demi Lovato can't drink alcohol anymore. She can't party anymore. She can't hang out in bars probably anymore. I don't know. It's probably not recommended. There's a lot of loss that you are giving up, and it's sad. And so that's another depressive part of people's early recovery, is just the bummer of sometimes I had a lot of fun on those substances. And you're telling me I can never do that again, ever, for the rest of my life? That's depressing. So there has to be a lot of talk and a lot of support. Group therapy is often helpful as well. Maybe even blood tests to kind of help motivate you a little bit. But that's debatable, because is that really coming from within? And I've been down this road with people, even with all these things, even with someone saying, yes, I'm 110%, I've hit bottom 5 times. I know that I almost died in the hospital, like Demi Lovato. I now can't see out the right side of my eye anymore. I know for sure that drugs are off the table. They're still at risk, and they still can relapse. They still can go back to the substances for another 5 years. I've seen it before. It is shocking to have someone hit bottom and, oh, for sure they're not going to, and then they go lower, they hit lower bottom. Okay, for sure they're going to quit now. I mean, how do you drink after that? They hit bottom even lower, and you're thinking, okay, for sure now the drinking is off the table. They might even say, yeah, the substance is off the table, but then they get right back into it. Our brains will do anything to not suffer. And if our brains associate substances as the only answer for us to not to suffer, then it's a very tempting idea. And this is why I want to bring up that there are therapists and psychologists and physicians and chemical dependency, substance abuse counselors who specialize in helping people recovery get through this. It's not without its work. They don't have a magic pill. The person suffering has to do a lot of work. But there is a path to recovery, and there is a path to having a fulfilling life without any substances. But you have to go to the right people. And so I just want to point that out. I just want to raise awareness around. They're not talking. Maybe they will, but they're not talking, and it's fine. I mean, the documentary is focusing on other things, which is good. But from my point of view, I want to point out that there are people that can help, and I have seen so many people get sober. Again, it's messy, it's a bumpy road, but I've seen so many people. And there is a road, and it is possible, and happiness can be achieved, and balance can be achieved way better than it was before. You'll have usually a depressing couple of years as you go through all the initial phases, but if you do all the work, so many people on the other side are thinking, I had no idea how good life could be. I thought that my life sucked without substances, and I thought my life was so good with substances. But when I look back, I mean, my life sucked either way. I was just choosing one terrible life for another terrible life. Now my life is beautiful and wonderful, and yes, I wish I could have a glass of wine every now and then like other people can, but I know that I am not made for that kind of stuff, and I'd much rather live this life than either of those lives in the past. So anyway, let's get back to watching.
And when I was leaving the house, she was like waving. I just like felt a little odd. I was just like, wow, like that was a really nice night. Why do I feel like I should have stayed? And we were halfway away from the house, and we pulled over. And I look at my friend Janelle and I said, do you feel weird? And she's like, I feel weird. Should we have stayed? Should we have stayed? And I'm like, no. She's a grown-up girl. In my head, I'm like, what is she gonna do? She's gonna go to bed. Like.
So I'm guessing that her friend is blaming herself on some level, that she should have stayed to help. And this is another common thing that people will do. Of course, it's not her fault that Demi Lovato used too much substance, and I hope that she doesn't blame herself. It is also normal to just recount the story, because not only was it a traumatic event for Demi Lovato, but it was a traumatic event for everybody. Everyone that went through this needs a lot of support, a lot of processing. I'm guessing this documentary might give them a chance to talk about what happened and get support from the public. And so this is another point to bring up, is if you have someone in your life that suffers from a substance problem, even if it's a friend that you don't see that often, it's going to affect you. It's going to scare you. It's going to traumatize you in all likelihood. It's going to sadden you. It's going to frustrate you. And often the other people that are watching someone suffering from an addiction will feel like, I need to help that person, which is fine, but you also need help for yourself. That's where Al-Anon comes in. That's where therapy comes in. That's where group therapy or support groups come in. And that's important to know. So if you suffer, because the profile is that often people that suffer from addiction, not always, will match up really well with someone that's very emotionally giving and someone who's very over-functioning of another person, someone that sees the person that's suffering from the addiction as like a little sister or someone that's fragile that needs to be taken care of. And that dynamic is fine on a certain level, but it also can sustain not only the problem of the use, but it can also cause this person to be neglected in that process. And so this person often will neglect themselves anyway because they're focused on helping other people. And a lot of therapists are like this too. And so just make sure you check in with yourself, because not only can you suffer from emotional issues, but you can be prone to compulsions as well. Because when things get too hard for you, you might just say like, well, if they're doing it, maybe I should do it. Or you might suffer in your health or your sleep or your relationships, or you might have burnout, which is another issue. Anyway, it's just important. And I hope that she gets the help, and maybe she already has.
I had had consensual sex, and there was one flash that I had of him on top of me. I saw that flash and I said yes. It actually wasn't until maybe a month after my overdose that I realized, hey, you weren't in any state of mind to make a consensual decision.
Wow, this documentary is really touching on a lot of issues that should be talked about more. And so kudos to Demi for bringing this up as well. Not only was she sexually assaulted in a criminal way, according to her account, but she's also talking about how it's a very common experience for people who are overly intoxicated on something that they either took voluntarily or they took involuntarily. And you wake up the next day and you think, yeah, it must have been consensual, I guess. But then a month later, or maybe years later, you think, well, wait, how could I have consented if I don't even remember it at all? I remember flashes. How could I have consented to that? And even if you did, quote unquote, consent in the moment, anyone understands rationally that if someone is completely over the top intoxicated, they can't really consent to anything, particularly something like that. And so there are laws in place to reflect that reality. And we are, in the past number of years, realizing that we need to define it as such. In the old days, they would have said, well, if you're going to get that intoxicated, you deserved it, that kind of stuff. And there's plenty of people who still believe that. So we want to be clear that everyone understands that when someone is extremely intoxicated, that they cannot consent to that kind of activity. Everyone understands that. And Demi is talking about that. And if you have been assaulted, make sure you talk with a therapist about it. You obviously can go to the authorities as well. It's important that we speak up about it. The analogy that I often will give is that when people are mugged on the street, you're walking down the street late at night and someone comes up to you with a knife and they take your wallet in your purse or something. And usually you call the police, right? You don't go home and feel ashamed of what happened and only tell one friend about it. You might tweet about it. You will call the police. You'll tell your parents. You tell everyone, because a crime has occurred. You were victimized. And emotionally, you want to tell a lot of people, and you want to try to catch the person. Or, there's just this normal reaction to being victimized by another human being. When people are sexually assaulted, it's a completely opposite reaction. Why is that? Because of our society. We, from an early age, are indoctrinated into a culture that tells us that to be victimized is partially, if not fully, your fault. And or anything regarding sexuality is hush-hush and shameful, particularly for women, that you're to blame. In some parts of the world, it's literally illegal to be assaulted as a woman. You have committed a crime when someone else has assaulted you. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the specifics on that. But I certainly know that even in my culture in the United States, there are a lot of people that still hold these ideas to be true, and a lot of law enforcement as well, a lot of people on Twitter. And so we have this difference. If you're mugged, you tell everyone. You call the police in all likelihood. If you're sexually assaulted, you might not tell anyone. Plenty of people never report it. Statistics show this. Maybe you tell one person, or maybe you tell your therapist in 10 years, and that's the only person you ever tell. Why do we do that? Why do we as victims do it that way? Well, because of our society. no one tells us directly, if this happens to you, you got to be quiet. It's not likely you've been told that directly. There's just so many messages in our society that it clearly gets through to people because very few people report it. Children, adults, any age will know automatically that it is a shameful thing and they shouldn't tell anyone. And when they do tell people, they often get extremely terrible reactions from people. People going into denial. Well, you shouldn't have been using those drugs. What were you wearing? Why were you hanging out with that person? Are you sure you didn't consent? And that's just your friends and family potentially. And then, of course, the legal system, depending, can be extremely abusive to people. Watch the Netflix miniseries called Unbelievable. It really shows the difference between two different police reactions. And also listen to my episodes in which I talked about that with Christy Forrester. She is an advocate, a therapist, and an advocate for victims of sexual assault. She had been sexually assaulted and went through the legal system and can talk in full detail. Listen to my audio episodes on that. But anyway, so Demi is bringing this up, and 2 thumbs up to her for raising awareness about this as well.
That kind of trauma doesn't go away overnight. And it doesn't go away in the first few months of rehab either. You know, that's something that sticks with you for a while after, because all of the daddy issues that I'd had growing up, now I was literally discarded and abandoned. That amplified all of my dad stuff.
Interesting. So she is saying that she has daddy issues, dad stuff, which abandonment, because of the suspicion I had from the descriptions in the last video about how the father suffered from a lot of things and probably, made a lot of promises and broke a lot of promises and abandoned her. And now she's talking about how this assault and abandonment. So she's not only is she talking about a sexual assault, but she's also talking about being left for dead by someone, and that person never called the police, that seemed to not care at all. And so that causes this trust problem, right? And just to put a fine point on, I don't know if this is what Demi's talking about, but we depend on other people. We need relationships. We need relationships to give us our attachment needs. We need water, we need food, and we need love and attachment and warmth and attunement and closeness. We need those things. And when we're looking for those things, one of the assumptions that we need to have is that other people are trustworthy. If we don't have that idea, if we think other people are not trustworthy in general, then we have a really hard time reaching out to other people, trusting what they're saying, not being suspicious of them, not being overly hurt by them, not being triggered by little indications of abandonment. And so I think that's what she's talking about, is that yet again, another man has abandoned me for dead, has treated me horribly, and now I have this idea of other people cannot be trusted. Now, watching this, if you don't have that issue, you might say, well, Demi, that's just one scumbag. And yeah, your dad suffered from a lot of things. Don't use those men as a template to generalize to all men. There's a lot of different people out there who are good people. You can trust other people. Okay, that's all fine and good. That's the conscious mind, but the full brain will understand the world through its experiences. And when your major relationships, some major relationships in your life, have taught you otherwise, your body doesn't necessarily believe that. And I work with a lot of clients on this issue. They might kind of cognitively know that people can be trusted, but their body and the parts of their brain that they don't have control over, their emotions, for example, do not believe that other people can be trusted. So I feel bad for Demi in this way. This is going to take a lot of time for recovery. Again, I've worked with clients with these issues for 10, 15 years and recovered a significant amount, but you never really get rid of that sensitivity and that trauma. But a good amount of really focused, competent therapy can actually help people recover for sure. So I hope that Demi gets the help that she needs. And I hope that she gets relationships that are trustworthy, such that she can learn, her body can learn that people can be trusted, so that she can get her attachment needs met.
But what's different is she lived through it. is that she survived it. She was where her father was.
Yeah, I'll second what they're saying here at the end of the video. If you or someone you know is struggling with an addiction, call 1-800-662-HELP. It's important to get the help that you need. Everyone deserves it. Everyone deserves therapy. Everyone deserves to recover from their traumas. Everyone deserves to go down the messy road of recovery, of substance abuse recovery or eating disorder recovery. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.